All right. Well, it's good. I'm glad y'all are here back for this week number 2. We're going to look at that. If you picked up a guide, I hope you did. And if you need a Bible, there's some in the back. If you want to follow along, if you didn't bring one with you. But we're going to go through the second part of our Exodus study. So let me pray. And let's kind of get started. God, we thank you for the chance to be together again on a Wednesday morning. We ask for your Spirit to be upon us so that as we gather in this place, that we may remind ourselves of who you are and of how you have worked through the past and our history and the history to make yourself known to us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so we're looking at the study of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. It picks up the biblical storyline right where Genesis leaves off. Last week, week number 1, we looked at how Abraham's grandson Jacob and his family of 70 moved their way to Egypt where Joseph, one of Jacob's sons, had been elevated as second in command to Pharaoh, and the family lived there, and they grew in Egypt a large number. And after a few hundred years, kind of the story of Exodus picks off, where the Pharaoh kind of doesn't think this is such a good idea. There's all these people, and he starts to mistreat them as slaves. And so then the story of Exodus is how that results in what God does in the midst of that. The word Exodus refers to the major event that takes place in the first half of the book, and we'll just about get there today. Is where my plan is. I thought we would get to that part, but I decided there was just too much in those do the beginning of that to get to the plagues and everything else to get to the point where that happens. That I was going to spend some time there, and so we'll get there next week where they actually leave Egypt. And this week, we're going to look at the first half of that story, first several chapters of that story. The phrase that happens here, the story kind of echoes some of the blessing that God gave back in the beginning of creation. I mean, it's the story from the beginning talks about how the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied, which is the command that God gives to the people in the beginning of the story. And then some of the things that happen with the plagues, as we'll discover, are ways in which God continues to work in that story. So let's look at Pharaoh first. Pharaoh is the worst character in the Bible so far, and his kingdom kind of epitomizes humanity's rebellion against the things of God. Pharaoh has so redefined good and evil that, according to his own interest, he says the murder of innocent children becomes good. And so Israel begins to cry out for help to their God. And God first kind of responds by turning Pharaoh's wicked plan upside down. An Israelite mother places her son, Moses, in a basket and sets him afloat in the Nile, where he drifts directly into the hands of Pharaoh's family. The child it says his name Moses, and it means out of, because he pulled him out of the water, is what she names him. And then in this story, kind of God begins to call Moses and set him aside to do some great things after he leaves Egypt after witnessing an Egyptian kind of mistreat an Israelite person, a slave, and so he kills him, buries him in the sand, and at age 40, Moses leaves Egypt. According to tradition, age 40, he leaves Egypt and takes refuge in neighboring Midian, which is kind of a dry and desert wasteland. And it kind of is set up to be kind of the difference between, you think about, Moses kind of grows up in Pharaoh's court. He's living in the lap of luxury, right? He's got all the things he could ever want. And now he's kind of out there in the middle of nowhere watching sheep. And it is really supposed to set up kind of a big difference between what's going on there. He went to the Redbird Conference, right? And so in this process, while things are getting kind of falling that way for Moses, things kind of continue to get worse for the Israelites, and God continues to hear the cries of the people, and then decides that he's got to do something about it. So he calls to Moses. So according to tradition, again, he was 40 years old when Moses left Egypt to go to Midian. He spent about 40 years of his life in Midian, and then was kind of headed back to work to lead the Exodus, and then of course they spent 40 years in the wilderness. So again, we talked about how this is kind of such a neat little division of Moses' life. It's probably was more to show that he lived a complete amount of time in one place, because that's a number of completion. 40 is in the Bible, and so it's not necessarily supposed to be taken as an accurate kind of a depiction of Moses' life. And so we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about. I want to give you this again. This is the timeline for this. Just remember this. We'll kind of pick up in Exodus and do the wilderness kind of stuff next week. We're going to not be together on the 29th. I'm out of town that day, so we're not going to have class on that Wednesday, just so you know. We'll not have class on that Tuesday either, Terry, so just so you know, too.
I just like to come both days. I can't wait.
That's right. So anyway, so we're going to talk about that. So that's kind of the story of this. That's what we talked about last week. This is what we're going to talk about this time. And this is kind of the beginning of the story of how this goes with Exodus, about the call of Moses. He's leading the flock of his father Jethro, a priest of Midian, and he comes to Sinai, the mountain of God, and an angel appears to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. And though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. And that's amazing, Moses said to himself. Well, that's weird. And he walks up, to see it a little closer. And when he does, God calls to him from the bush and says, Moses, Moses. And he says, here I am, Moses replied. Can you imagine, you're up there on this mountain, you've been watching sheep all day, you're sweaty, you're nasty, you hear this bush kind of cuts on fire in the middle of nowhere, and you walk up, well, that's weird. And then you hear somebody calling your name. I mean, it's kind of a weird situation. Here I am. I imagine it's more of a, not just a declaration of, oh, yes, Lord. It's just like, what? Who is this? Kind of figuring out what's going on. And God says, don't come any closer, and take off your sandals because you're standing on holy ground. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And when Moses hears this, he covers his face, because this understanding of the people of God was that if you saw God face to face, then you would die. And so Moses doesn't want to see God's face. And then God says, I have seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries, and because of their slave drivers, I'm aware of their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt to a fertile and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, land where the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites now live. And I am now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people out of Egypt. So God says, I'm about ready to do this, so I'm going to send you to do this. And then he says, but Moses protests, and God says, I'll be with you when you do this stuff. And then it kind of goes on from there. So we're going to talk a little bit about the story and about the confusing names that kind of get wrapped up in this story. Moses' father-in-law in this story has three names. We first meet him as Reuel in chapter 2, verse 18. And then here where we read today, he's Jethro. And then later in Exodus, he's also referred to as Jethro. He's also called Jeter. Not Derek Jeter, I don't guess, but Jeter, anyway. And we think that's probably just an alternate spelling for Jethro. So he has those three names. And so why is that? Well, we're not sure exactly why, but he does. He has three names, and it seems to be the same person. And then we talk about the mountain of God. The mountain of God in the story of Exodus has two names as well. It's called Horeb, but it's also called Sinai. And these names are kind of confused in this. And what this probably shows us about Exodus is that it wasn't all, the story as we have it now was probably not all written by one person at one time. Because you wouldn't change the names halfway through your story. If you did, you'd probably fail your English class, right? So it wasn't written probably by the same person at the same time. What happened is probably there was several different oral traditions of the story of the Exodus, and somewhere someone wrote it down, and then somebody took all of those kind of traditions and wove them together And that's how that kind of comes up with different things like that. We see this other places in Scripture when God's name is referred to differently in different places. We talked about that in Genesis. Other places that's the same case, or a story in the Gospels where one gospel writer tells a version of a story in one way, and another gospel writer tells it in a different way. It's probably different traditions that kind of get woven together in a lot of ways. So this kind of has a couple of names here, and we know that. Scholars think that the confusing names is probably due to different authors and being edited together lately. Another possibility is that these mountains were probably could have been two different locations. That we get that from some biblical references. Even Paul, who talks about Sinai, talks about it. Everything else, he locates that in Arabia. In Galatians, he talks about that. And now Jerusalem is just like Mount Sinai in Arabia. So it may have been kind of two different locations. There's another reason why we may know that as well. We'll get to that in just a minute. Moses, while working as a shepherd, led his sheep to the wilderness, to this mountain, whatever it's called and wherever it is. And it was there that the angel of the Lord appeared to him, or God appeared to him in the flames of fire from within a bush. And again, it was kind of supernatural because the bush was not burning. So that's why we'll get to this. Why a bush? All right. Why do we talk about that? Well, the Hebrew word for bush is Senah. Do you see any similarities there with that Hebrew word with Sinai? Right. There's a lot of things where that kind of happened. So the question is, was it named Sinai because it was a place where bushes grew? As we know, a lot of places are named in America cities are named that way because that's where a certain tree grows or a river flows or something else that might happen. So that could happen, or that could have been written back into the story because it was a bush. The other thing we know is that other places, this bush is almost referred to as an almond tree instead of a bush. So there's some questions about, with scholars about what that means for that. But it's there. And the lampstand in the tabernacle and later the temple is described as a tree with branches, 7 branches. And so that's there. And fire is used as a symbol for the presence of God all the time in the Old Testament. And the fancy word, if you want the seminary word for that, is theophany. Phone, excuse me, I should say it that way. It's a visible manifestation of God. So that's what that fancy, that's what my seminary education got me. I can tell you those words, right? So one possibility of why the bush is there and the bush doesn't burn up is that it's a preview of the plagues that are going to happen that we're going to look at today in the rest of the story, because that's kind of a weird thing to happen. That fire happens, but this bush doesn't burn up. So it's a preview of the plagues and other stories in Exodus where kind of natural properties, natural things are suspended so that God can do something there. So it was a bush that wasn't consumed. So there's a lot of different reasons why it may be there, or it may have been a bush that wasn't consumed by fire. I could have done that. I don't know. I'm just saying there's all kinds of possibilities out there, and you can look at those things. And if you're kind of into that kind of trivia kind of stuff, like I am, it kind of is interesting to look at that. So Moses is intrigued. He goes and look at a closer look at this bush that's burning, and here's God calling his name, and he says, "I'm here." And God ultimately identifies himself. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. But again, Moses is afraid to look and says, "I'm sending you out to do that." So there's a couple things we want to talk about. 3 lessons that Moses needed to learn from the story. That Moses needed to learn, but we can learn as well. First thing is to see things from God's perspective. Moses complains that he can't speak well, that he's not the right person for the job, that he's not. But he needs to learn that. And throughout the story, God kind of graciously corrects Moses' perspective on himself and on the world. and tells him, it doesn't really depend on you, Moses. It depends on me. I'm the one who does things. And that leads us to the second thing. God works, and we're the instruments. And God would deliver Israel from Egypt. Remember, he said that I have decided that I'm going to rescue my people, and you're going to do this. So that the passage kind of here reminds us that God does the work, and we are the instruments that make it happen. But ultimately, it's all in God's hands, and that serving God always leads to more. The sign of God's presence with Moses was confirmed with a promise. I will be with you always. I will be with you, and I will lead you, and I will help you, and I will do this kind of stuff. And it kind of leads to more. So Moses kind of gives him some grief about, I'm not the right person for the job, and he kind of does that stuff, and he kind of says that. It's interesting that God identifies himself in this story as the God of his ancestors, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That world, they were very aware of the gods of other people, and so for God to speak, it was the idea that they wanted to make sure that there's this God of your ancestors, and it also reminds Moses who he was. That you're not a Midianite. You're out here in Midian watching your father's sheep, or you weren't an Egyptian, even though you were raised in Egypt. You're an Israelite. These are your ancestors, and he also reveals him as a personal God. I am. It's not just a generic statement. It's a statement about who God is himself, and that leads us kind of to understand that God's name is Yahweh here. And that kind of really begins to be important as we do this. Again, if you remember back, Brian preached on this before about Yahweh kind of being the breath. Yahweh, kind of that idea. And it kind of is a way that they would do this. It was a name for God, and that was important because all the other gods had names, and so they needed their God to have a name, not just I am. And so that became important too. It's interesting that story always reminds me of another story. When I was a kid, I had a friend who was Brian, who was a Jehovah's Witness. And one day in school, he told me that his God was going to come down and kick my God's butt. And I said, Brian, my God is Yahweh. He goes, no, it's not. No, it's not. Your God's not Yahweh. I said, it's good, Brian. He said, no, it's not. And so I said, when we get off the bus, you walk down, stop at my house, and I'll show you. He goes, okay. So we walked down there, and we sat on the porch, and I got my Bible that I just gotten from like a third grade Bible and everything else. So I'm like fourth grade, I'm this young kid, and I'm opening my Bible, Yahweh, 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 kind of stuff like that. Mom said, I should have known then what you were going to do for the rest of your life, but I didn't, and I didn't either. So it's kind of, this is a name that's important. We don't use it today for our culture much, but certain parts of our culture do. So the message is clear. God has heard the cries of his people, and he's sending Moses to do this, and he's going to send some help with Moses and some tools with Moses to make this happen. And the call of Moses kind of extends into chapter 4, and 3 times more Moses expressed doubts about this and concerns about this. What if they don't believe me? In response, God gives him 3 signs that were kind of there, and lets him know that this is going to happen. Moses said, I'm not eloquent, I don't speak well. And God assures him that he's going to send Aaron with him to do this stuff, and all this kind of stuff's going to happen. And so he kind of does that. But God seems to always kind of be faithful to equip those he sends. That's an important part. My call story is that I was, despite what happened on my porch as a 4th grader with Brian Stockholm, I never wanted to do this the rest of my life. In fact, when I felt as a college freshman, felt more clear about the call of God in my life, I did my best to convince God that I wasn't the right person for the job and he should pick somebody else. It's not what I wanted to do with my life, and that didn't work. And God continued to say, well, we can work with this, we can work with this. And so finally it was time for me to do this. And even no matter how hard I tried to prove it, it didn't work. So again, God graciously provides Aaron, Moses' brother, to assist and help him. And in fact, God had already prompted Aaron to meet up with Moses when he got to Egypt so they could do this stuff. So there's 3 life lessons that we learn from the call of Moses. God redeems our mistakes. Nothing we do disqualifies us from service to God. I mean, Moses killed a guy. He is still the person that God chose to kind of lead his people out of Egypt. So God redeems our mistakes. There's hope for all of us, a second chance, an opportunity. God equips those whom He calls. We don't have to have all the answers. We can't figure everything out. But God will give us what we need to be able to do that. God creates space, if we give space for God to move, and that God is faithful all the time. Moses started as a reluctant leader and grew into a passionate prophet and a mighty man of God. And it was because despite his questioning and his unfaithfulness, God was continuing to be faithful every step of the way. All right, so then let's spend some time looking at the plagues and Pharaoh's hardening heart. In the Exodus story, there are a series of plagues. It's the part of the story we kind of know. The first part of the big story we know is the plagues. After the first 5 plagues, Scripture says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. However, after each one of those, Pharaoh hardened his heart. But in the second set of plagues, it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. There's a difference in the turn of phrase. That Pharaoh is making a decision, and then ultimately God is doing this, which is difficult, but again may have been something more to do different versions being kind of woven together in that. So let's look at the thing. We have plagues that the high drama from blood, frogs, lice, insects, pestilence, boils. Your skin crawl and your scalp kind of itch when you start talking about the creepy, crawly, infectious kind of things that happen in the story of Exodus, as we'll look at that. Pharaoh is forewarned about some of the plagues and surprised by the third one. He's kind of upset. And after each one, until the end, he refuses to free the Israelites. As we'll see, the plagues progress. They get more severe, and with each plague, God not only matches but exceeds the Egyptians' God's power. So we're going to compare what's going to happen with each of these plagues, how they match up to a god of the Egyptians, how that was a god that could do something. And so with each of these things, after with each of kind of the sets of 3 that happen, Moses and Aaron make these plagues happen, and then the magicians of or priests of the Egyptian gods kind of can mimic that, and so, but with a third one each time, they're not able to do it the same way. So it kind of amps up the power all the time. So the plagues are, I guess, before we look at them, are not only a demonstration to the Egyptians, but I think are also meant to demonstrate to the Israelites who this God is that's rescuing them. Because here's a God who can do these amazing things and kind of suspend normal physical kind of laws and rules about how the world works. And so he does this stuff, and he kind of does it so that the Israelites, maybe even more than the Pharaoh of the Egyptians, desperately needed proof of God's power and might. And these people have been slaves for generations, and they're thinking they don't matter. What's the big deal about us? And now their God comes to them and does amazing things, and it kind of demonstrates to them how great their God is. And so I think that's an important. In the Bible, these plagues are a demonstration of the dramatic demonstration of God's power, and they're supposed to convince Pharaoh to do something that he should do, but Pharaoh's not worth convincing. And each of the plagues can also correspond with some of the later traditions that develop, not just the Passover and with the last one, but all of them, kind of the history of some of their celebrations and how they did. Before we look at the 10 plagues, let's look at the significance of them. The first plague there is it's there to demonstrate divine power, not only to the Egyptians, but to the but to the Israelites. It's there about talk about justice and retribution. The plagues are seen as a form of divine justice against Pharaoh's refusal to free the Israelites, highlighting the consequences of kind of that oppression. They have a symbolic meaning, again, connection to Egyptian mythology, and all of that kind of stuff. And then they lead ultimately to Israel's liberation, and then they have a religious component as well. So those are the kind of things that are important with these stories. All right, so let's look at the 10 plagues. You get to get some pretty pictures of some. Now, if you ever want to know what your God could look like, you can kind of look at there.
Steve?
Yes.
So you're saying, and I've never heard this,
Right.
That for every plague, there was an Egyptian god who was able to do the same thing.
That they understood is able to do the same thing. It's interesting because I was reading this stuff. One of the things that's happened is that two of these gods, Osiris, maybe you've heard of it if you study any kind of Greek, Egyptian mythology, there's this god Osiris who was a god of fertility and resurrection and underworld and all this kind of stuff for them, was the son of two of the gods we'll look at in this story. And the way that his brother, one of the other gods we look at, decided was jealous of him and killed him. He locked him in a coffin and floated him down the Nile River. Which we know about some people who put stuff and floating down the Nile River, don't we? There's some weird kind of things that happen with this that are kind of interesting. So yeah. So there were. The one point of the plagues was so that Moses and Aaron could demonstrate that the one true God was greater than all the other gods that they thought they understood. And understand, in that culture, in that time, the Israelites and later the Christians were kind of monotheistic kind of religions. There was one God. But they did not necessarily think that there were no other gods in the world around them. We don't think that. It's not a part of our world because that's not kind of how that works. But that's kind of the understanding of how that worked in that culture, much more so than we do now. All right, is that clear? Does that answer your question?
Except that last part you just said.
Okay.
So they were aware. They accepted the fact that there were other gods that had power.
It depends on how they interpret it. Some of them thought they had power. Some of them just thought that other people worshiped them. And like Paul would later say when he would go to Mars Hill, he would go to they would have all these altars to all these gods. And Paul, one of them was to an unknown god because they did not want to have they didn't want to have an altar to a god that they weren't aware of, just in case they missed an opportunity, right? And so Paul just said, "Hey, let me tell you about this unknown God that you talk about. I know that God, and I can talk about it." And so it became kind of this God is the true God, and all these other gods are just kind of false gods. But they didn't think of it as necessarily that they had a much more kind of mythic kind of understanding of the world, like Roman mythology and Egyptian mythology. That was not uncommon even for the Israelites and people in biblical times to kind of understand some things about the world.
Were there actually hundreds of gods that the Egyptians?
Yes, there were all kind, and as we'll look, Pharaoh was a god, so was the highest god, as we'll discover. So yeah, there were gods of everything, and there were often family gods in those situations. Of the God of this family, we worship this kind of God. It was kind of our clan or family kind of thing that wasn't just that everybody did, but this small group of people kind of worshipped and served. And the idea is that part of this thing is it changes some of our understanding of things. And this is for free. This wasn't in my notes, so just go. Is that you like when we think about like a tithe now, and at 10% of a tithe, that's for us that's a goal to get to. If you're not there, get there. That's a goal. But the tithe was first kind of demonstrated from God with the idea that just give me 10%. Because the idea was for fertility gods and other gods was if I want my crop to produce, then I got to give more to the god. And if my crop was, if I gave 20% and my crop was abundant, then next year if I give 25%, then I'll get even more of my crop. Or if I gave 20% and I didn't have a good year, then I obviously didn't give enough, and I've got to give 30% next. So it was kind of like this bartering system with God, and God said, no, it's just 10%. And so it was not initially a tithe, culturally, was not a goal you reach for. It was a limit to not have to feel like you had to bargain with your God. So it became a kind of a different understanding of things from how we look at it and how they probably looked at it back in the day when they had all these fertility gods and did all these strange stuff. And these gods, this is not the weirdest looking God you'll look at today. So I'm just going to tell you. Yes.
So then, when they were tithing,
Yes.
did they give it to Pharaoh? I mean, or did they just?
There were various ways in which you would do it, but yes, a lot of times it ended up being, well, we'll give it to the
The head god Pharaoh.
the priest, the Pharaoh, and then that would and the royalty would kind of take it on, or the priest, whatever will that god would kind of take it in themselves and use it for their own benefit. So yeah, it wasn't. But there are also some sacrificial things. So the sacrificial system of the Old Testament that the Israelites used was not unheard of for other gods in that day too. All right, let's look at the plagues. The first plague was they turned water into blood. They had Moses had the staff, and Aaron did the first couple plagues, and as a spokesman for Moses, he touched the rod of the Lord to the Nile River, and immediately turned blood. All the fish died, and the river just started to stink. And so then the magicians of the god that was there, they tried to duplicate that. They were able to do that, and so Pharaoh was kind of unimpressed with how that happened. So for 7 days, the water throughout all the land of Egypt remained in this state, so it was unsuitable for drinking. Again, 7 days is the perfect length of time to know that it was actually done completely, and to demonstrate that Yahweh was superior to all other gods of Egypt. And the Egyptian god here is Hapi. He was the god of the Nile. He was a water-bearing god. He was also known as the Lord of the fish and the birds and the marshes. So that's kind of where, and think about the Nile was one of the things that happened with the Nile was they would pray to this god because every once a year the Nile would flood and it would come out of its banks and it would flood over the land, and that would make the land fertile so they could grow the things they needed to grow. So it was an important god for them. All right, that's Hapi. And then we get to Heket. And that's sometimes spelled with a Q instead of a K, but anyway, that's there. This is where frogs covered the ground everywhere the Egyptians went. There were frogs everywhere. Aaron kind of touched the ground, and frogs came up everywhere out of the river. They were in the houses, they were in their food, they were in their clothing. Every place you could think of, there were frogs. And from the greatest to the least, no one in Egypt escaped the plague of frogs. Pharaoh's magicians, again, were able to kind of duplicate this a little bit. They were able to bring about the frogs, but only Moses and Aaron were able to get the frogs to go away. It's an important part of the story, right? I mean, if you're going to bring frogs, you want to be able to get them to go away, and so they were able to do that. So this god is Heket. Heket was the goddess of fertility and water, and as well, and was depicted often as having the head of a frog. So that's how the images of Heket were drawn. She had the head of a frog, as you can see there. She's pretty, isn't she? All right. So then we got a plague of lice. Enough said. Right? Anytime somebody brings it up, he's kind of... Anyway. Pharaoh would not concede here, even after this display of power from from God. He would not let the people go, and so after the frogs and all that, and the blood and everything else, so Aaron stretched out his rod again and hit the dust of the earth. And when he did, the dust became lice throughout the land on both people and beasts. And the very dust, again, is referred to in the creation process of man, is now used to plague humanity as a reminder of its mortality and its sin, which lead to death. The magicians of Pharaoh are humiliated. They can't do this one, and so they're upset with that, and they profess that this is by the finger or the hand of God. This was the last plague that kind of involved Aaron's involvement. He was kind of the ones who did these first three. I guess kind of after a while, Moses kind of built up his confidence and did that. So the Egyptian god there was Geb. Geb was the god of the dust of the earth. He was keep the dust down. And that's an important thing if you live in the desert, to kind of keep that down. It's an important god to worship, I guess. And so they would do that. But again, real pretty guy. There. So then we get to plague number 4. Plague number 4 is when the flies swarmed all over Egypt. And this began kind of the first of the miracles of separation or differentiation, they're sometimes called. Moses met Pharaoh one morning at the Nile River and demanded to, again, let my people go. Pharaoh hardened his heart and disregarded the request. And so he made a pronouncement, and flies swarmed all over the earth. But this was the first time, and this one in 4 began this time when only the Egyptians were affected by the plague, and the children of Israel remained unscathed. Imagine walking around and your Egyptian neighbors have flies all over them, and they don't mess with you. So that's kind of how that happened. And this kind of adds to a different level because it became really uncomfortable, a lot of destruction. Pharaoh tried to do tactics and began bargaining with God, showing his desire to maintain power and authority over God. He tried to dictate terms, telling them that they could sacrifice, but only in the land of Egypt. So that didn't kind of work. Moses wouldn't budge, and so Pharaoh relented them, telling them not to go very far. They could go a 3 days journey away from where they lived to make the sacrifices they needed to make to worship their God, but they couldn't go very far. They still had to come back to work. That bargain was made so that Moses would get the flies to depart. And he does that. So this is the Egyptian god Khepri. It was the god of creation, a movement of the sun, and rebirth. Khepri is depicted as having the head of a fly. So that's why that god kind of ties in with what's going on here. So they're trying to worship this god. Well, this god controls the flies. Well, then control the fly. Well, that god can't. Our God can't. So there we go. My God's going to kick your God's butt. That's what Brian Stockholm told me, right? All right. Plague number 5 is the death of cattle and livestock by pestilence. Moses demanded again, Pharaoh, let my people go, that they may serve me, and told Pharaoh what's going to happen if you don't. It was giving kind of an advanced warning of what's going to happen here, just in case. Hey, if you don't agree to this, the next thing I do is this: tomorrow the hand of the Lord will be felt upon the cattle and the livestock of the Egyptians, and they're going to die. And so this had a huge consequence. The plague affected the Egyptians by having an economic effect. It was a disaster. Their food and transportation, their military supplies, their farming, their economic goods, all these were produced with the help of livestock. Still, Pharaoh had a hard heart, and he would not listen to what the Lord said, but he remained faithful to the Egyptian gods and goddesses. And so this is the Egyptian goddess Hathor, Hathor, who was the goddess of love and protection. And usually it was depicted with the head of a cow. So there you go. That was there. So that your goddess Hathor cannot protect your cattle. My God can take your cattle. And that becomes an important part of Pharaoh's next bargain with God that comes up after the next plague. Plague number 6, which is ashes turned to boils and sores that cover the Egyptians' bodies. Again, directly attacked only the Egyptian people. The Israelites were not affected by this. Moses took ashes from the furnace of affliction and threw them in the air. In the time of the Old Testament, a furnace was kind of this oven, this crucible for refining gold and silver. And the word is often used figuratively in Scripture. In this text, it's used to kind of describe kind of a time of severe affliction. As dust and from the ashes blew all over Egypt and settled on man and beast alike, and there were sores all over their bodies. As with the previous two, the Egyptian plagues divided the Egyptians from the children of Israel, and God gave protection to his covenant people. However, the severity of God's judgment now became kind of a little more personal, and the people themselves began to feel it. Cleanliness was very important to the Egyptian people. And so this plague kind of makes them unclean, and the magicians that we've seen throughout the previous plagues are unable to perform the ceremonial rituals that would clean the people and make them whole again. Gods and goddesses in this unclean state were not even allowed to stand before the Pharaoh and do this. They're seen in the scriptural account kind of no more. The Egyptian goddess Isis is the goddess. This is one of the more well-known names, I think, of Egyptian god. And she was the goddess of medicine and peace. And they could not heal themselves, and so she was not able to be effective. Plague number 7, a plague of hail rained down in the form of fire. And hail is bad. Hail fire is bad, really bad. I'm not from Tennessee, I can't really say it that way, but that's kind of how that goes. Anyway, Pharaoh is warned again of the impending doom that's going to happen because he didn't do this, and so he doesn't want to kind of neglect his own Egyptian gods and goddesses, and so Moses kind of brings down hail of imaginable size and destructive power and fall from the sky, and it would ignite when it hit the ground. Yeah, the movies they could make from these. I've often said that all these great stories that they make movies out of, and they make up all these stories. If someone would just really make up some of the stories from some of the Old Testament stories and even the New Testament stories, and make them kind of as dramatic as they really are, it would be pretty cool. And you don't even have to make them super religious, kind of like some of those some super religious films get kind of corny, but you can make this really cool. So I think so.
Well, they did make the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, they did. It's pretty religious. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, that's a great movie, but it's got an intent more than just to tell the story, right? That's So this was meant to show again, Pharaoh, that there's no one like God on earth, and you need to listen. Again, a division is felt between the Egyptians, but now there are some who are in the Egyptians who are starting to kind of convert to understand, like, obviously this is a real God, so let's worship this God, and so they're starting to, and so they're kind of having some relief from some of this stuff as well. They're protected, and their crops were kind of there, but a lot of them they're destroyed, and everything kind of happened, and their crops are destroyed, and they weren't able to have food and all that kind of stuff. And again, this becomes much more uncomfortable for them and makes their life even harder. And they're given a chance to turn to the one true God, and they don't all do that, and so God doesn't relent in this situation. And here's this next pretty lady, Nut, who is the goddess of the sky. It was interesting when I was typing this up. I had to go back and change all of the goddess words to a lowercase g, because you're not supposed to use that except for you're talking about God. My computer just naturally capitalize that all the time because that's how I usually type it, right? So that's something like that. So there we go. All right. Then we've got locusts sent from the sky to eat every green plant. Pharaoh's still not listening. He's still not doing what he needs to do. So he's there and he's starting to. They ask him to let my people go, and he won't do it. And so they send these locusts on the earth and in kind of swarms that were there. Again, affects their whatever food was still around was there, and Pharaoh just wouldn't listen, and so he's not doing that. And this is the Egyptian god Seth, who is the god of storms and disaster, and has a. I wasn't quite sure that some animal head there. It's kind of weird looking. It looks sort of like a donkey, sort of like a camel, sort of like a rabbit. I don't know what it is. It's kind of this yeah, maybe an Andy, right? It's chaos and disaster. So storms and chaos. So there you go. So
The jackal?
Jackal.
I think it's a jackal.
jackal,
That's what it's
maybe.
supposed to be. Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Makes me think of those heads that the doctors wore during the plague.
Okay, there you go. She's just tying it all back into the plague stuff. I know.
You know, in the, what was it, 18th
Yeah.
century?
Yeah.
Well,
19th,
right.
yeah, they wore those pointy nose masks. It was to keep the smell.
Yeah.
I mean, they were trying the germs and the smell.
Yeah.
But people's stomach were fine.
Yes.
That's what it makes me think of. And they probably got it from that picture.
That's why we used to sing that song, Ashes to Ashes, with a pocket full of posies. There's posies in your,
Right.
so it wouldn't smell so bad, right? All
All
right. Sorry. All right. So the number 9 is 3 days of complete darkness that covered Egypt. Darkness falls upon Egypt, and it's kind of unannounced. He's kind of warned. Moses has kind of warned Pharaoh that the stuff's coming, but this time he just does it. And so they haven't listened, and so they still think their own gods and goddesses are going to be able to do things, and they're not. So 3 days of darkness. Now it's interesting. Religiously, think about the symbolism of 3 days of darkness in Scripture. There's all kinds of these things kind of tied back together, and all that kind of stuff. And so there's some there. It was so immense that it just kind of was constant. It covered the land of Egypt. The sun was the most worshipped god. Ra was the most worshipped god, is the god of the sun in all of Egypt, other than Pharaoh himself. And they prayed to that god and served that god, did all the things they did, and it didn't work. And so this was had a huge kind of if you've ever kind of been in days where you haven't seen the sun for days, it kind of has a psychological effect as well as the emotional effect and a religious impact, and it has all. And it was also a representation of death, judgment, hopelessness, the complete absence of light. Those are things that were there. If you're going to turn to your gods, have your gods shine a light here, because our God can do this. And so again, this was Ra, the sun god, was one of the most important gods. Moses, in all of this stuff, would continue to make deals. Like he would start to bargain with the Lord, and he would say, "Here's another deal. I'll since all the Egyptian animals have been killed off from pestilence and hail, fire, and all these other things, you all can leave, but you got to leave all your animals behind, because the Israelite animals were not affected." And this would help them kind of rebuild their stuff. Well, this wasn't good enough for God, because, again, the sacrificial system for the people of God was an important thing, so they needed their animals to go with them to be able to worship their God, and that was not going to be something that Moses was going to accept for that. But they tried, so God didn't compromise here, and he had set the terms that, no, you're supposed to let us go. So this made Pharaoh mad, and so Pharaoh kind of reacted to this and kind of set up his own. He released the own plague from his very own lips. He warns Moses. He says, "Get thee from me. Take heed. See my face no more. For that, when you see my face again, you're going to die." next time I see you, you're going to die. So what happens is that Moses says, all right, fine. We'll have a plague where we'll send, at midnight tonight, an angel of vengeance, an angel of the Lord is going to pass over the houses of these people to the heart of Egypt, and every firstborn in every house is going to die. The oldest son of the Pharaoh who sits on the throne, the oldest son of the lowest servant, girl who grinds flour, every firstborn of livestock, whatever's left, the livestock will die. The loud wail will rise throughout the land of Egypt. People will be, oh my gosh, this is there. But among the Israelites, it will be peaceful, so peaceful that you won't even hear a dog bark. No one was stirring, not even the mouse, right? The dogs aren't going to even bark, right? That's there you go. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites, and all the Egyptian officials will run to me and fall on the ground before you, saying, please leave. And they will beg, hurry and take your followers. And I will say, okay, I will go. So that's what happened. The Israelites are given strict instructions so they do not feel the judgment, to mark the door with the lamb's blood, and to take with them bread, but you weren't allowed to have time for the bread to rise, so that's why they use unleavened bread for a lot of things in their rituals. And so they would take all this stuff and they would leave, and Moses would say, "Oh, let my people go." Again, the Egyptian god here is Pharaoh, because Pharaoh was the highest. They understood themselves as gods, and they were higher than all the other gods that were there in Egypt in their mythology. So they were there, and they kind of set out to kind of create this thing, and when it happened, he let them go. But again, as we know the story, as they're leaving, as we'll look at next week when we actually get into them leaving Egypt, they left, and as soon as they leave, Moses is like, "What have I done? All this free labor that we've used to build all this stuff is gone, and now everything's been destroyed by all these plagues, and we're going to need to rebuild all this stuff. We got to get these people back." And so that's when that happens in the beginning of the Exodus story. So those are the plagues. What questions do you have about the plagues? Again, I think that part of the story is that they're weird kind of stories because they kind of, is that how God works? God kind of, sends these kind of storms to happen and things like that. And what does that mean for us when, I remember when I was, my first appointment, we had a tornado that came through the area we lived. We lived at the bottom of Brooks Hill, outside of Louisville, and the tornado came over the top of the hill, went down through, it took down the Baptist church where they were building a new sanctuary. It tore that place up. Another tornado formed in a farm that was right behind our parsonage, and went out, and it was really a very scary time, and things happened. Those of you around here know that. You've been through some of that stuff before. It was a very scary time for us. But a lot of people would kind of say, see, God's pronouncing judgment on you all for this and everything else. And I was like, oh gosh, it's not the way this works. And I remember we kind of had my church kind of set up some things where we distributed clothing to people who didn't have clothes, and food to people who didn't have food, and all kinds of supplies and everything else. We kind of became a clearinghouse for people to come and bring stuff and give it out. And we put a big sign up that said, "Don't look for God in the winds of the storm. Look for God in the hand of a person offering you help. That's where you find God." And I don't think that's the way God works necessarily, but I think in this situation there were some things that were at play that God had to do to kind of make some things happen. And any time this could have been, this starts out really, really small and kind of grows to the end of these plagues. And any time Pharaoh could have put a stop to this, and he didn't. And I think that's a part of the problem. But I do think they also kind of are there to kind of, the story is there to kind of, creation story in the beginning was about God. The first creation story in the Bible was about God exerting control over the chaos. And I think somehow when God's saving these people in these plagues, it's also about God saving his people from the midst of chaos and building something and taking control over it. There's some similarities there between all of the story as it starts, as God continues to carve out what it means to be people of God. So there's some interesting stories, and like I said, we could go into a lot of other detail about each of these plagues. There's a lot of fascinating stuff that happens with the stuff, but that's kind of the quick look at the 10 plagues and kind of how they tie into things. And it really was, I think, God trying to, through Moses and Aaron, trying to demonstrate that he was the real power, that these gods and goddesses that these people worship didn't have any power in this situation. And that's ultimately what gets kind of presented.
The 10 plagues really didn't convince Pharaoh.
What's that?
The 10 plagues alone didn't really convince Pharaoh, because once he let him go, you said, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself.
No.
No, let's go get him back. Well, that means bring on 11, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think you could argue that it was also kind of a way in which they were the sea closing in on them was just another way of saying, all right, well, I'll show you the power. We'll put the same rod down, the same staff that they've used for all these things. He puts down in the water splits. They walk across on dry land. The Egyptians chase them. The water's closed, and boom. It's almost 11. It's almost 11, and it really is almost kind of like, all right. God says, all right, I tried to tell you.
Enough of this.
I tried to tell you. And there's also, for us today, I think there's also another sense in which, here comes the preacher side of me, not the Bible teacher side of me coming out here. There's also a sense in which we're really talking about how God almost, the way that some of this works is that we get warnings all the time through Scripture and through other things about how we're supposed to behave and the things we're supposed to do and the things we're not supposed to do. And some of that is there because God knows what's best for us. And we get ourselves in trouble when we just go ahead and do it anyway. And it's almost like we can't say, well, God is punishing you for doing this. God's like, no, I tried to tell you not to do this, but you chose to do it anyway. And so you have the consequences. I mean, that happens in life. I mean, God tells us not to, we know that there are certain things we shouldn't do. We shouldn't drive 100 miles an hour down some town in Watertown with the snow's keeping them up and they're not doing anything, right? But if you do that, you're gonna have consequences for that. If you behave in a certain way or if you do certain things, you're gonna have consequences of that. And it's almost, some of this stuff is almost like, the beginning, again, Moses warns him, look, Pharaoh, you let the people go. God wants you to do this. If you're not going to do this, there's going to be some consequences to this. And I think that's true of us. I think that's true in our lives as well. We have consequences when we do things. And sometimes it's not God pronouncing punishment on us as much as it is God says, part of my call story is, like I said, I tried to convince God to pick somebody else to do this and I wasn't the right person for the job. And so sometimes I did some things I'm not real proud of. When I was in college, kind of the same, God said, and God would say, we wish you hadn't done that, but we can get past this. Well, but the truth is, there were consequences of my stupidity, of things that I did that I shouldn't have done, that I had to deal with. And that's just the way life is. There are consequences. And there were consequences for Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Yes?
Steve, it looks like to me in all these plagues, all these stories that over time, Pharaoh actually believed these and said, okay, well, I'll go along with that, but he tried to compromise. You can go, but you got to do this and this. It seemed like he actually, there was a belief there that there was a pretty powerful God somewhere. I'm almost going to.
Yeah, I think there was some of that, but there was also a sense in which it wasn't an ultimate convincing. It was just a temporary convincing.
We can make this work.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming today, and we'll be back next week, and we'll look at actually them out leaving Egypt. So.